The dust settled around the wagons as the traveling settlement made its stop in Medicine Ridge, Wyoming. It was 1887, and Margaret Whitmore had seen enough hardship in her 38 years to last several lifetimes. She stepped down from her wagon, her sturdy frame moving with the confidence of a woman who'd learned to carry her weight in more ways than one. The town wasn't much, just a scattering of buildings along a dirt road, with mountains rising in the distance like silent witnesses to human struggle. Margaret had come here looking for work, maybe a fresh start. Her husband had been gone 3 years now, and she'd spent that time baking bread for wagon trains heading west. She noticed them immediately. The man in the black hat, kneeling in the dirt beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The child wore a faded pink dress, her dark hair tangled and unwashed. She was thin, painfully thin, and she stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Margaret watched as a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, tried to coax the child to take a piece of bread. The girl just stood there, unmoving, her small hand limp in the woman's grasp. "Please, sweetness," the younger woman pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just one bite. For your papa." The man in the black hat, Thomas Garrett, looked up at the woman with desperate eyes. "She hasn't eaten in 4 days, Ruth. 4 days. I don't know what else to do." Margaret set down her basket and walked over, her boots crunching on the dry earth. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best thing you could do was simply show up. "Forgive me for intruding," Margaret said gently, "but I couldn't help but notice you might need some help." Thomas stood, removing his hat. Up close, Margaret could see the exhaustion carved into his face. He was probably 40, maybe a year or two older than her, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. His hands were calloused and scarred. "Thomas Garrett," he said quietly. "This is my daughter, Annie. And this is Ruth, our neighbor. She's been helping me since." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Since her mama passed," Ruth finished softly. "6 weeks ago. Fever took her quick. Annie hasn't spoken since. And now she won't eat." Margaret knelt down slowly, bringing herself to Annie's level. The child's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment before going blank again. "My name is Margaret," she said, not expecting an answer. "I make bread, the best bread in 3 territories, or so I've been told. But I'll let you in on a secret." She waited, letting the silence stretch. Annie's eyes moved slightly. "The secret is this," Margaret continued, her voice warm and unhurried. "Bread isn't just flour and water and yeast. It's got to have something else in it. Something you can't see or touch. You know what that is?" Annie remained still, but Margaret noticed her head tilt ever so slightly. "It's got to have a story in it," Margaret said. "Every good loaf of bread has a story baked right into the middle of it. And I think you've got stories inside you that need to come out. But they can't come out if you're too weak to tell them." Thomas started to speak, but Ruth put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Margaret reached into her basket and pulled out a small roll, still warm. It wasn't fancy, just a simple dinner roll, but it smelled like home. Like safety. Like everything that had been lost. "This roll right here," Margaret said, tearing off a small piece, "has a story about a little girl who was brave. Enough to keep breathing even when breathing hurt. That's you, Annie. You're that brave girl." She held out the piece of bread, not pushing it toward the child, just offering it. Letting Annie decide. The seconds stretched into a full minute. Thomas held his breath. Ruth wiped tears from her cheeks. Then, slowly, Annie's hand moved. Her small fingers took the bread. She brought it to her mouth and took the tiniest bite. Thomas let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. "There you go," Margaret whispered. "That's good. That's real good." Annie chewed slowly, mechanically, but she chewed, and then she took another small bite. Margaret stayed there in the dirt, her knees aching, watching this broken child try to find her way back to life one crumb at a time. When the piece was gone, Annie looked at Margaret with eyes that finally seemed to see. "Would you like another piece?" Margaret asked. Annie nodded. Just barely, but it was a nod. Over the next hour, Annie ate 3 pieces of bread. Not much, but more than she'd eaten in days. Thomas couldn't stop thanking Margaret, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you did that," he said. "We've been trying everything. The doctor said she was wasting away from grief, said some children just couldn't come back from that kind of loss." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Children don't come back on their own. They need someone to walk beside them, to sit with them in the dark places until they're ready to see light again." Ruth squeezed Margaret's hand. "Will you stay? At least for a while? I've been trying to help Thomas, but I've got my own family to tend to, and Annie responds to you in a way she doesn't with anyone else." Margaret looked at this makeshift family, all of them broken in different ways, all of them trying to survive. She thought about her own losses, her own grief that she'd carried alone for too long. "I'll stay," she said, "long as I'm needed." That night, Margaret set up her small tent near Thomas's homestead. It wasn't much, just a cabin and a barn and some chickens scratching in the yard, but it was home for him and Annie, and Margaret had learned that home wasn't about the place. It was about the people who gave you a reason to come back at the end of the day. For the next 3 months, Margaret came every morning. She'd bake bread with Annie sitting nearby, watching. At first, the child just observed in silence. But slowly, day by day, she began to help. A small hand would reach out to touch the dough. She'd nod when Margaret asked if she wanted to add the salt. Thomas watched from a distance, mending fences, or tending to his small herd of cattle. Margaret could feel his gratitude, but also something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said one evening as Margaret prepared to leave. "You've got your own life to tend to." Margaret paused, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. "What life would that be, Thomas? The one where I bake bread for strangers and move on before anyone knows my name? I'm tired of that life." He stepped closer, his hat in his hands. "Ruth told me about your husband. I'm sorry. It's a hard thing losing someone." "It is," Margaret agreed. "But you know what's harder? Forgetting that you're still alive. Forgetting that you still have something to offer this world." Thomas looked toward the cabin where Annie was sleeping. "She's eating on her own now. Talking a little bit. You did that." "No," Margaret said firmly. "She did that. I just showed her it was safe to try. You did the rest. You kept loving her even when she couldn't love you back. That's what saved her, Thomas. Your love. It was always there, waiting for her to be ready to feel it again." Something shifted in the air between them then. A recognition, a possibility. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Margaret and Thomas were married in a small ceremony outside the cabin. Annie stood between them, wearing a new dress Margaret had sewn, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. When the minister asked if anyone objected, Annie spoke for the first time in months. "She makes the best bread," the little girl said solemnly, "and she tells the best stories. She should stay forever." There wasn't a dry eye among the dozen people gathered there. Years passed. Margaret's bread became famous throughout the territory. She taught Annie to bake, and the girl grew strong and healthy, eventually taking over the bakery they built in town. Thomas's ranch prospered with Margaret by his side, her business sense as sharp as her baking skills. But what people remembered most wasn't the bread, or the ranch, or the prosperity. It was the way Margaret had seen a broken family and decided to become the missing piece. Not because she was needed, but because she chose to be there. Because she understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't solving their problems, but simply refusing to let them face those problems alone. On Margaret's 65th birthday, Annie, now a woman with children of her own, brought her a gift. It was a recipe book, handwritten, with every bread recipe Margaret had ever taught her. On the first page, Annie had written, "For the woman who taught me that nourishment isn't just about food. It's about love. It's about showing up. It's about staying. Thank you for staying, Mama Margaret. Thank you for teaching me that broken things can heal, and broken people can become whole again, if someone cares enough to sit with them in the dirt and offer them bread." Margaret held that book to her chest and cried, not tears of sadness but of gratitude, for a life that had taken her broken pieces and made something beautiful, for a family she'd found when she'd stopped looking, for a little girl in a pink dress who'd taught her that sometimes the greatest courage is simply taking one more bite, one more breath, one more step forward into life. If this story warmed your heart, please like and share it with someone who needs reminded that they matter. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things through simple acts of love. And comment below about a time someone showed up for you when you needed it most. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.